Good to go? All right. Had to wait for the live streaming technology to kick in here. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is David Mahan. If I haven't met you, I teach religion and literature here at the Divinity School and the ISM. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Lana Schwebel Memorial Lecture, which is one of the gems in our literature and spirituality series that continues every year. This lecture was established in 2008 in memory of our beloved colleague Lana Schwebel, who served on our faculty at the ISM from 2002 to 2006, but died suddenly and tragically in July 2007. Because of Lana's devotion to the study of religion and literature, her family carried on that legacy by establishing this prestigious annual event, a lectureship that has included prominent literary artists and scholars, including Robert Pinsky, Marilynne Robinson, and our own Christian Wyman. So I just want to say how grateful we are to Lana's family, who brought the gift of this event to us and whose enthusiasm and generous support has sustained it over these many years. Before I introduce our speaker, our format for the evening will begin with readings by him, followed by a conversation with me, and then an opportunity for you to ask him questions. And as per our custom, we have books available, which our author will be happy to sign for you after our program and after you, of course, have purchased them. Ron Hansen is the author of, excuse me, I'm going to take my mask off. Ron Hansen is the author of 10 novels, along with short fiction and essays. He's also a screenwriter. He's the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including a Guggenheim, and has continued to teach literature and creative writing over the course of his career at universities around the U.S., currently serving as the Gerard Manley Hopkins S.J. Professor in the Arts and Humanities. That's a great name for a chaired position. At Santa Clara University in California. He also is an ordained permanent deacon in the Catholic Church, often serving as a spiritual director in that capacity. I first encountered Ron Hansen's work, though I didn't know it was his work, when I saw the 2007 film The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, which is a great title. And this was, of course, based on Ron's 1983 novel of the same name, a work of historical fiction that was a finalist for the prestigious PEN/Faulkner Award. Then several years later, I came across a book titled Mariette in Ecstasy when I was looking for new works for my class, Faith, Doubt, and Redemption in 20th and 21st Century Fiction. And I immediately got a copy before I even connected it with the Ron Hansen who had written the novel about the assassination of Jesse James. I love the book and have taught it since, finding it to be one of the most penetrating works of the contemporary religious literary imagination that I've encountered. When I did finally make that connection, I was surprised. To slightly modify a famous line from another Western, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, I thought to myself, who is this guy? How did the author of a Western novel about Jesse James and other novels about notorious outlaws, including the Dalton Gang and Billy the Kid, and even a novel about Hitler's niece, come to write a work about a young woman postulate at a convent in upstate New York in the early 1900s? A novel that so explicitly explores Catholic faith in a work of such evident Christian intelligence and insight. I came to realize later, as I read more by and about Ron Hansen, that my surprise arose from my own failure to appreciate his larger literary vision, captured in part by the title of this event, as well as the title of his notes toward a memoir, Hotly in Pursuit of the Real, the meaning of which will certainly be one of the topics we explore in our conversation with each other. One reviewer has written of his work, like his predecessor Flannery O'Connor, Hansen does not shy away from the difficult topics, but rather confronts them with bravado. He is a writer to be treasured for his skill, style, and intellect, but also for his courage to write tales that resonate with those who are fairly skeptical of feel-good stories. Humankind is messy and unkempt, and Hansen rightly portrays them as such. This is what Christian literature looks like in the postmodern age. And I couldn't agree more, and am thrilled that we have the opportunity to have him address us this evening. So please welcome with me, Ron Hansen.
Thank you, David. That's a wonderful introduction. I know some of you have read some of my essays and maybe other pieces of fiction. So I thought I would give a few readings of fiction here, but I wanted to talk about where the books came from, what the idea behind them was. My first novel is called Desperados, and I was very poor, and I thought it'd be lucrative. And I thought I knew a little bit about the Old West because I live in Nebraska, where you drive 1 hour from Omaha and you're in the Old West. And I was really struck by the friendship or the love between these brothers. The Desperados is about the Dalton gang, who deliberately tried to imitate the exploits of the Younger and James gang. And they got wiped out in Coffeyville in 1892. Emmett survived and went to prison. And then when he got out of prison, he went to Hollywood and became a screenwriter for Western movies and was a friend of Wyatt Earp. Kind of a remarkable story. And after that, I was trying some other kinds of fiction. And my brother-in-law said, why don't you write again a Western, because you did very well with the first one. So I wrote The Assassination of Jesse James, because I'd learned a lot about how Jesse James actually got shot by Bob Ford, and I realized no movie or book had ever covered it appropriately. And so I went to the newspaper sources, really. I read the Kansas City Star for every day that Jesse James was alive, and at least in the period of time I covered it. And it was fascinating because you learn what the prices of things are, what they call things, like the names of some of our clothing have changed quite a bit. So I was amazed by everything I discovered. And I remember one of the first things I wrote, somebody had asked me to write a short story about the Old West for a Tri-Quarterly magazine. And one of the things I wrote was a very late scene where Bob Ford goes out to talk to Jesse James just before he's about to kill him. And Jesse kind of hypothesizes about God and says his voice is like a waterfall. And goes on and on about it. And I think I had to cut a lot of it, and it never made it into the film. But I was intrigued by that and realized that I'd written 10 pages about that one night, and I would need to write a novel rather than a short story. And I decided to call it this unwieldy title of The Assassination of Jesse James by Robert Ford, because I wanted to imitate the way books in the 19th century would tell you basically the whole contents on the cover. So I shortened it quite a bit from what it would be back then. But Brad Pitt so loved the title that he had it written into his contract that Warner Brothers couldn't change it. I ran across this thing quite by accident, where it's an interview with Brad Pitt and somebody else, and he says, are there any lines that you remember from any of your things, your movies? He says, yeah, there's one from Jesse James where he says, I look at myself and my red face and my mean eyes, and I wonder what made him become that way, or something like that. I don't remember my own lines, but I was really flattered that of all the lines that Brad could have mentioned, he mentioned that one. But I thought it got really to the heart of what Jesse James was about. There's really very little religion or spirituality, and even though Jesse was a hymnist in his church and his father was a preacher, and as was Bob Ford's father, a preacher. But there is one thing I added late in the book when he goes, Bob Ford, after he's killed Jesse James, ends up in Creede, Colorado. And he is made aware of one of the myths about Judas, that he went on to, he didn't die from hanging, that he went along in life and he was disfigured, polluted, all kinds of terrible things happened to him. And this person was kind of wishing that would happen to Bob Ford. Eventually, Bob Ford did get killed himself. I had no intention of writing another Western, but I didn't know exactly what I was going to write. And I came across this old book. It was a book of album of photographs taken by Saint Therese of Lisieux's sister Celine. And it was from the inside of a convent, a cloistered convent, and just showed the women at work, cooking, doing laundry and things like that. And I thought it was really kind of a fascinating perspective. And I thought somebody should write a book about that. And then I thought, if I don't, who's going to do it? And so I decided to write it. And I originally set it in France and realized that I didn't know the names of things in France. And I was teaching then in New York State. And so I realized I could look out the window and just describe what I was seeing, and that would be the descriptions I could put in the novel. And so I moved my French convent over to the United States, which happened a lot back in the 19th century. They kept being kicked out of France for one reason or another. I began that not knowing what kind of style I should have. And so I did a style that was kind of very 19th century. That was almost like the perspective, well, it was of an old priest, I guess. And then I decided to try another style, which was born out of my reading of William Carlos Williams' poems. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. And I thought that really focused on the realness of things and how just naming of things can have impact for you. And so I read both versions to a girlfriend of mine, and she said, "You're kidding, right?" And because I was ambivalent, and she picked the William Carlos Williams imitation. So I wrote it almost as if it's a prose poem. And I finally sent it to a good friend who I share all my manuscripts with. And when I finished the draft, he says, "Well, you've got a 60% chance of getting this published." And then it did get published and did fairly well. I was, well, let me read just a bit of that. I was, in my writing, besides William Carlos Williams, I was influenced by the movies of Ingmar Bergman and the way he uses the camera. And so I think you'll see that in this small piece. As David pointed out, it's about a young woman who becomes a postulant in a convent. Her sister is the prioress. Shortly after the prioress dies of cancer, she comes up with the stigmata. And the whole novel is about the dissension within that convent. Some people thinking that she's a saint and wonderful, some people thinking she's a fraud. This is from the perspective of another postulant. Tallow candles, skin like the moon, eye sockets tinged with green, eyelids lightly fluttering in dream. The postulant's mouth is sore and cracked and welted purple by her own teeth. Sighs and caws to her slow and intricate breathing. Sister Hermance is hooking and knotting lace as she primly sits on a stool in night watch. She collapses her handiwork in her lap and just stares with poignance at Mariette. She's about to get up, but pauses. She gives it some thought and gets up after all, setting her lace aside and then holding on to Mariette's left hand like a tender nurse reading a pulse. She tilts her head to fondly inspect Mariette, petting her brow and touching a dark hair away from her cheek. She hesitates for a second, and then she unwraps the torn strips of cloth from a hand that is stained as red as a dyer's. A great copper verriere is on the floor. Sister Hermance retrieves a ball sponge from the verriere and wrings it tight before softly daubing at the hand wound. She peers at it and at Mariette. She whispers, "I just have to see." And then she gently lowers Mariette's left hand until it is submerged in pink water. Blood seeps silkily from the hand wound, turning and rumpling underwater until it gradually untangles into nothing more than color. "I hope you're not angry," she says. "We are all wondering. We didn't think it would be so real." She lifts up the postulant's hand and presses it into her habit as she considers Mariette. "We aren't amazed. We thought you were different from the first." She pets Mariette's wrist and kisses a knuckle. She whispers, "We are so privileged." She holds the palm open and kisses it. "You have turned your face from me too often. You have been frightened by my affection." With reverence, Sister Hermance licks the blood inside the hand wound. "I have tasted you, see?" Tears streak shining paths down her cheeks as she says, "Ever since I first met you, I have loved you more than myself." Half a minute later, she says, "You know this is true." She stares at Mariette's sleep and whispers, "You have been a sacrament to me." When that book came out, I got a review in the Washington Post that said I'd written Desperados, I'd written this book about Jesse James, and then he came up with this. A totally negative review. And finally, the Washington Post sent a reporter out and said, "Well, we tried to kill your book, but we couldn't, so we're going to do another review." And then this one was positive. Nice that they capitulated like that. After that, excuse me, I had gone to San Miguel de Allende one summer to teach, and while there, fell in with the expatriate community of Americans down there, people on trust funds or people who wanted to retire there. It's a very big expatriate community. And there was one guy there who was at a party. A person who wrote romance novels had a lot of money, and he would have parties every week. And this guy got into a fight with somebody afterwards, and he ended up punching the guy, and the guy fell down on the cobblestones and banged his head and died. And so this man I knew put him in his Volkswagen and drove as far as Cuernavaca before he realized what he'd done and how he couldn't get away with it. So he drove back in and turned himself into the police. And one of my other friends went to visit him while he's still in the jail. And he says, "You know, it's not so bad here. My maid comes and brings me my meals. I'm teaching them chess and how to speak English. This may be the happiest I've been." And I was struck by that. So that became a crucial part of my novel Atticus. I wrote it at one point, and it was way too complicated. It included paintings like Mark Rothko does, and it just was out of this world. And so I really came back and did another draft where Atticus is modeled on my grandfather, who was a 19th century man. He was born in 1869, I believe. One of those unforgettable types. He would come to Omaha once a year, and people remembered him always. And I wanted to portray Atticus as what God would look like in human form if he came back right now. So he had a mustache. He was kind of short but plain-spoken. And Scott was kind of modeled on me, but, you know, it takes such a long time to write a novel that you have a lot of influences coming at you. And one was the tale of the prodigal son. And I realized that's what I was writing. That Scott Cody is the prodigal son, and Atticus is the prodigal father. And that became a movie with James Coburn, which was absolutely terrible. They allowed me onto the set, but they didn't let me read the script because 4 people had contributed to the script, none of them me. And I was there with one of the other script writers, and James Coburn was saying something about body bags, and it made no sense whatsoever in terms of the context of the novel. And so I turned to the screenwriter. I said, "Did you write that?" He said, "No." "Did you write that?" I said, "No." And James Coburn overheard us, and he started blowing lines one after another. And finally, a publicist came and escorted us to a restaurant where we stayed for about 3 hours until it was time for me to fly out of there. They didn't want me to poison the movie any further. It was called Atticus, who was great because when I was driving there, it would say, "Atticus this way, Atticus turn right." And I had a little chair with my name on it and all that stuff. But then they decided that there was a movie called Attica, and they thought it would sound like this was another prison drama. So they called it Missing Pieces, which actually made no sense. But again, I made the money and got out of there. I was teaching then at UC Santa Cruz, and I just made it to full professor. And the president of Santa Clara University contacted me and said, "Let's go out for dinner. I have an offer you can't refuse." And so he took me to an Italian dinner and talked about this job, but he didn't give me a lot of details. And I thought I was probably getting paid more at UC Santa Cruz than I was going to get paid at Santa Clara. And at UC Santa Cruz, I had to teach 4 courses over 3 quarters. And I knew the standard teaching load was 6 courses at Santa Clara. But I really wanted to teach there. So I prayed to Gerard Manley Hopkins about it. I thought, you know about teaching, you know about writing. Is this a good deal for me? And so then the president calls me on the phone and says, "Have you decided to take the job?" And I said, "No, I'm still thinking about it." And he says, "Well, I've decided to call it the Gerard Manley Hopkins Professorship in Arts and Humanities." And I was persuaded by that this is the right thing to do. And then it turned out I was wrong. I was going to get paid more money and teach less than I thought I was going to. So that worked out to be a pretty good deal. But this is kind of a labor of love, Exiles. It's partly about Gerard Manley Hopkins' life, but partly about the 5 nuns who lost their lives in the wreck of the Deutschland. And this is... what happens is the boat they're on, called the Deutschland, founders in the estuary of the Thames River. There were so many shipwrecks back then that shipwrecks could be the cause of shipwrecks, that you ran into the other boat. And that's what happened somewhat to this Deutschland. And these nuns are heading to Missouri, but they're caught in this storm, and it's cold and snowy. And everybody's worried about drowning. So the nuns are saying their divine office, the little office of the Blessed Virgin, at night. And then as they're waiting for rescue, and then Sister Enrica is the woman I'm writing about. Her maiden name, I don't even remember what it was. But anyway, Sister Enrica shut her Bible, and the 5 were sitting in silence, meditating on the scripture, when a runnel of seawater slithered into the saloon and widened so that surprised passengers hopped aside of its lake or jerked their shoes up from the floor. Close to midnight, Second Officer Carl Thallenhurst tilted inside the saloon and yelled, "All crew and passengers upstairs to the weather deck." The stewardess, Katharina Schlossbauer, immediately got a white napkin and waved it overhead like a tour guide as she commanded the 100 and more to leave their belongings and form up in pairs so she could conduct them in accordance with the captain's wishes. "Shall we go?" Sister Barbara said. Sister Enrica was puzzled. "We have no choice." "We could be disobedient," Sister Norberta said, "but then we wouldn't be good nuns." "Won't it be cold?" Sister Aria asked. "No, it'll be hot," Sister Norberta acidly said. "Hot as Hades. You'll want a parasol and a fan." "Sister, shush," Sister Brigitte said. "Don't you shush me." "Sisters," Sister Enrica said. Sister Norberta stood beside Sister Barbara as she put on her mittens, snaggily repeating, "Won't it be cold?" Sister Enrico was stationed in front of the four nuns and paired with the ship's doctor, Franz Bluen, who was gloved and hatted and irritatedly winding a long woolen scarf around his neck. "Wallenhorst should have announced the rescue boat was here," he told her. "This peremptory ordering of the whole lot of us upstairs just keeps us in suspense." "So it is here?" Another jolt of a wave tipped him off balance, and he righted himself. "Certainly," Bluen said. She recalled queuing up like this at the School of the Holy Cross in Aachen. She just received Holy Communion and was praying as the Holy Cross sisters put the girls in orderly rows for their entrance into school. And high up there on the landing of a steep flight of stairs was Wilhelm Fassbender, the 8th grade teacher, Katharina's adoring father, who smiled down at his daughter and widened his arms in welcome. Elderly Dr. Bluen gripped her elbow in a gentlemanly manner to help her up the gangway, though it was he who pawed the handrail in his struggle up the steps. Shocking cold hit them at once as they exited the hatchway, and there was no other vessel. Dr. Bluen was outraged. Some passengers were scurrying to the gaslit pilot house and crowding into its heated parlor. Some were in a hopeless wander or holding on to the fence around the giant funnel. A great wave boomed against the ship, and cannoning seawater that seemed high and heavy as a house hit Sister Enrica full on, joining her to its onwardness. She screamed and could hear other men and women screaming as she and they were carried on a raft of its swift, stinging journey across the width of the ship. She flailed in a last chance for the ship's railing, but she was plunged over the side of the Deutschland and into the coldest cold of water she'd ever felt. She lost all air. She lost a shoe. She could not tell up from down. She was suffering and terrified and helpless, and she could not claw up to the surface. Her black veil smothered her face. Her black cloak furled around her like the strips of burial cloths binding Lazarus in his tomb. And she could not help it. She gasped and seawater filled her. She coughed and convulsed and took in some more. Weakening and in pain, she slashed out with her hands and kicked her feet in the finality of a wild rage. But she was burdened and yoked by her habit and demanded by the sea. She remembered as she sank, Jesus wept. It goes downhill from there. I wrote a couple of other novels, as David mentioned. One was Hitler's Niece. One was Isn't It Romantic, which was the antidote to Hitler's Niece being very grim, and Isn't It Romantic just being a farce, basically. I did some stories too, but I thought I would read you from my novel, The Kid, about Billy the Kid. I had no intention of writing this, but then somebody said I had written a review of a book about Billy the Kid long ago, and I must have said that I'd like to write a book like that myself, and he reminded me of it. And so I took it on. And this brief episode is about when Sheriff Pat Garrett comes and kills the kid in the middle of the night. What I would like to his kid's last words were actually KNS, who is it? And so this section of this novel is called Who Is It? But I decided to do something different that you would never see in a Western. So he's been shot and he's dying, and one of the guys looks at him and says, and now he'll never be old. And then I shift from that to Billy's recollection of what happened. The gun was raised and then it flashed. The shock of it was like a punch that spun the kid and swatted him to the floor. Then there was a fiery, searing pain that overcame all other feeling, but it waned as the kid's body acquired its education in dying. The kid felt himself floating upward, felt a surprising happiness. With each quitting of an organ or process, there came a greater liberation, an aliveness, an awareness of never having been so real. Seeing himself on the floor and the chaotic concern around him, he felt affection for all of them, felt pity for who he used to be. But he was overwhelmed by his new fluidity and increase, his ever greater sense of wonderful love and limitlessness, of having now what he'd always wanted but couldn't ever name. That at one point was the end of the novel, but I decided it was too heavy as an ending, so I put it close to the end. I'll just stop there and we can do our conversation.
So, sorry, we have to hit the microphones. Thanks. It's on? Yes, it is. So, Ron, thanks for giving us a sampling. And it confirms for me the surprise that I felt at the eclectic nature of your subjects across all of them. And you mentioned some things about what motivated you towards these subjects. I'd be interested to hear more about that. But I'm also interested to hear what these novels have in common and the thread. And it strikes me that a lot of them, even the more religious, explicitly religious ones, deal with some dark sides of humanity.
Yeah, they're all outlaws.
Yeah, you said that even about Mariette.
Right.
That she's as much of an outlaw as Jesse James. Can you talk about that, that common thread and what
I
it is?
think it's the nature of writers to feel outside of the general group of humanity, that they feel in some way like spies looking in on other people, and other people have normal lives where they have this eccentric life. And so I think there's a natural affinity for outlaws, for criminals. You see that with Truman Capote writing In Cold Blood. Mm-hmm. It's very common that you're attracted to these people who are schemers and con men and so forth. I think also there's that idea that a novel needs problems, and so you need criminals or people outside of the general run of mankind to have problems. Some people like Philip Roth or John Updike would use divorce as the problem, but I wanted something more tangible, more exaggerated than that. So I think that's what the only thing I could think about what have in common is, well, of course, Hitler is one of the biggest outlaws or criminals of all. And his niece was exactly the opposite, really a sweet woman who was charming and so forth. And that I hypothesize that he either had her killed or killed her himself. And that's what the whole novel's about. Because he had said at one point that she was the only woman he ever loved, even though she's his niece, the only woman he ever loved or would ever consider marrying. And from the point where he killed her, every Christmas Eve he would spend a night staring at her portrait and to kind of reverence to her, of her in that way, and had no feelings for anybody else except for Gailey. So I was struck by that, and I'd been reading about Stalin and about Hitler, and suddenly I thought, I can't let this go. But that's what for me. That's what happens in novels. I'm a terrible channel changer, and exactly the reverse of what you would normally think. Any channel I get on a television, I find interesting, and so I watch it for. It could be Korean cooking. I watch it for a while, and the same thing happens with me and reading or hearing things. Sometimes something affects me that gets rooted in my head, and I have to get rid of it by writing about it. And I think criminals do that for me.
Yeah, interesting. Is it also, I'm thinking of Walker Percy's comment or his reflection that a novelist has to be a good diagnostician.
Right.
And given some of the darknesses in these characters who are hovering around the edges, but probably closer to us than we like to think. Right. Do you find yourself doing that? That these are the human condition trying to diagnose us in some ways is part of what attracts you to these subjects?
Yeah, you're not only a diagnostician, but you're a psychiatrist in some way, trying to figure out why these people have gone so wrong.
Yeah.
I end up having a kind of affection for most of the people I write about, just because it's like that walk mile in my shoes. You understand them after you've been with them for a while, and you can see that they're broken in some way. Some seem irremediable, which is Hitler, of course, but most of them just have peccadillos, something that has made them go awry.
And is there some inclination towards redemption that you also want to communicate? It's almost a bromide to say that a film or a novel is powerfully redemptive, but
right.
I mean, do you think of fiction writing as in some way enacting redemptive?
Yeah, I think of how a person who goes to a psychologist will say all the things terrible that happened to them, to the victim. And a novelist goes to people and says, and it's more confessional, these are the things they did. These are the things I did. And so it's more honest in some way, and it's less therapy by excuse and more of therapy by honesty and integrity.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking about this, the signature phrase that you borrow from Flannery O'Connor, hotly in pursuit of the real. And even thinking about redemption and its connection to that. Can you talk about different facets of what the real is that you are interested in as a writer? And, what does it look like to hotly pursue it as a writer?
Well, I think there's a kind of Christian writer who sugarcoats things and shows immediately how Christ could save him. And I think what Flannery O'Connor was getting at is not shying away from any material, but facing it frontally and somehow seeing in that where God is, or where God is absent. And Flannery was talking about hotly, meaning you should be passionate about your subject, and you should be in pursuit. It's a seeker's act, and it should be something that we can identify with that's tangible in the world. No ideas, but in things. I don't remember who said it, the poet. And so that's what I was looking for. That's why I feel like I should be allowed to write about anything that happens to human beings, because God certainly sees all those things and either accepts or rejects them. So there's more equanimity to God's view of the world than a lot of people think, I think. And that should be the stance of the writer as well.
She also talks about, in talking about the way a novelist has to be committed to the concrete to make a believable world or whatever. She says, though, that there are things that exceed us, and she calls that mystery.
Right.
Is that a part of the sense of the real that you want to also convey through your work?
Totally. Mystery is very important. Well, that mystery touches the transcendent, and both those things are of interest to me. And especially, I think, growing up with the Catholic liturgy, there's not everything is solved. It often is just portrayed up there in the Mass. And you see what people are doing or what their ministers are doing, but they don't explain themselves. And I think, like in a lot of the Protestant services I see on television, at least, there's one guy up there just explaining everything, and I like the mystery of the other manifestations.
You use the phrase also seeing into the middle of things. And
Right.
so mystery could be something that is indicated but beyond. But the middle of things also could be contact with the real.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, you see into the middle of things, it's like what Hopkins talked about as inscape, that
Yeah.
you perceive what's really going on in a person, despite how they portray themselves, and what motivates them and how God has touched them.
Yeah. So do you, I'm just curious, are you consciously thinking, how can I point this work towards that mystery? Or I just have to do my job as a novelist, and it will, like someone doing the liturgy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. I think I think it was Simone Weil who talked about attentiveness and awareness, and about observing things around, and that in whatever you see, you can see some element of God in that. And so I think that's what I'm aiming for in my fiction, is to give some kind of hint of what's going on. I always say that people without faith see in black and white, people with faith see in color, because we're so aware of all the other shadings and all the things that are kind of hidden from our eyes, but we know are there.
Yeah. Flannery O'Connor also speaks about the sacrament and writing, and you have that phrase, including the essay, writing as sacrament. And can you talk a little bit about that? You also mentioned the holiness of the ordinary in the context of talking about the sacramental nature of writing.
Right.
So not just how you understand that, but how do you think that shows up in the writing itself for you?
Well, one of the definitions of a sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible grace. And so what a novelist is doing is providing visible signs. And it's for the reader to pull out what the grace is. And I think even just the appreciation of fine writing is a sense of grace. And I was talking to Chris earlier today that what really I enjoy about poetry is the sudden surprises that you see in the language itself, and which kind of blows your mind. And you see there's something else going on there than you expected. And that's what we're looking for in all of our fiction and poetry, I think.
Yeah. Since I've particularly taught Mariette and Ecstasy, I wanted to push into that a little bit further, because I found that to be a really sacramental work. So the energy of it is the religious fervor with eroticism, and there's all of the shuttling back and forth in time, so it feels disorienting. But the combination of literary elements, the poetry, the letters, the testimonial, so it's not just plain prose either, and all of it together seemed to be radiating, and it seemed to be acting sacramentally. Was that conscious on your part, that the combination was going to project something? Or
there were some aspects of the novel where I felt, what would an angel or God say about what they're looking at? And I try to describe the way they would see it. And that might be an insect getting down on a pond, or it might be what flour looks like when you roll it out, things like that. And I thought that would convey something not only about things, but about God's intent for those things.
Yeah, I mean, well, and again, even the style, it just felt really tangible, the combination of those elements. And so it was very effective. I was surprised at the way it began with the poetry, and set
Right.
the stage and how that created an environment around the cloister, and then within the cloister it was darker and in shadows and that sort of thing.
Well, that I wrote it in present tense just because I wanted to have the sense of sameness.
Yeah,
And so at one point, Mariette's father comes, he's a doctor, and he talks about the World Series and other things. And it just seems like an abrupt invasion
yeah,
in this kind of that they had their ordinary routines and their prayers and so forth. And just the outside world didn't impinge on them.
yeah,
So, and that's always been the way. So that's why it's in the present tense.
yeah. I want to come back to Mariette and Ecstasy
Okay.
as I share it, but you said at one point in one of your essays that imaginative writing has the possibility of serving as a religious experience. And can you talk about that from both from the perspective of the writer and the perspective of the reader, and in terms of what you hope your work enacts or achieves?
Yeah, there. I think in some ways, writing is almost like a trance-like activity. A lot of times I'm not in a trance, but sometimes I think, where did that sentence come from? You begin a conversation with somebody, and you might have a few lines of dialogue, and then suddenly the characters start speaking in ways you didn't expect them to. So that's kind of what is happening, at least for the writer. And for me, sometimes it feels like prayer. In fact, in my novel on exiles, Hopkins talks about the fact that he's writing these poems and nobody's ever going to publish them. And another Jesuit says, well, why write them? And then he says, well, why pray? And that's kind of conveying what I feel about the writing act itself. And normally it doesn't happen, but on occasions it does. There's a spark. And I think that that's what I hope happens with the readers as well. They're swept away. And, their own reading of my material might have a different consequence or different translation. So what they're getting out of what I've written might be something I didn't intend at all.
Yeah.
But I'd said this earlier about Robert Frost says a poem deserves every interpretation it gets. And I think that's what happens in fiction as well.
Yeah. Well, you say it in another essay, if I can find it here, about the effect on the reader of putting us in a place where we feel like we have to choose, or there's a certain urgency about choosing the good versus the evil.
Right.
And again, this is explored in every one of your novels. So you don't want to write work that is aiming to convert, despite Hopkins telling Bridges, my
Right.
poetry is meant to convert you. You
Yeah.
don't want to do that, but
Right.
but that moral arc that you hope we catch
Right.
as your readers and feel that sort of urgency. Is that putting it too strongly to say that we feel moral urgency, or would you rather the effect be a little more subtle and perhaps more effective?
Well, I would love urgency, actually, but I don't know if it happens that often. But I think appreciation is all I want. One of the reasons I think I can go back at earlier work I've done and not think it's very good, but I know I was doing the best I could at the time, so it lets me off the hook. And maybe in the future I'll write terrible books, but I'll be trying as hard as I can.
Yeah.
And I think that the reader responds to that. You can't fake it. You have to really believe in what you're writing for the reader to respond at all.
Yeah. Well, that's a word of encouragement to any of you who are aspiring writers, to do the best that you can and believe in it. I want to think about that also, and I'm not sure if advice is the best way to ask this, but how would you advise literary artists today? And I'm thinking, first of all, for those who are writers of faith, to use that phrase. And you said in the interview with Brennan O'Donnell, it used to be that all you would write about was God and humanity. Some think that if you do that now, you're either breaching good taste or you've lost your mind. And you spoke about writers of faith perhaps feeling a sense of exile
Yes.
or distance
again,
from their
outlaws.
culture. Outlaw, sure. So, how would you advise those who are writing out of their own faith? Again, however that gets expressed, but
Yeah, I think in some ways, if you want to have an audience stay, the faith has to be beneath the surface. You can't have conversion tropes all the way through your fiction. I had a student once who, it's just a short story, he gets on the bus, sees this unhappy woman and says, "Have you accepted Jesus Christ, your Lord and Savior?" And I thought, you can't do that.
yeah,
It doesn't work. You won't find an audience. But you can tell that same story in a subtler way and have the reader come around to it rather than you telling them to do it. It's like anti-didactic.
yeah. Filling in the gaps,
Right.
letting us be the ones who participate in the
so-
story.
Yeah, it's like in Socratic dialogue. You ask questions and have the people come back with the answers rather than, "I got the answer for you, take that down."
Yeah. Did you find yourself falling into a pattern that you realized you needed to resist in order to maintain that kind of poise, so that the religious was available but not, imposed on us? Or
Yeah, I thought that fiction operates in a different way than almost any other activity, or poetry, of course, all the arts act that way. But a friend of mine used to joke that I have the ministry of the cocktail party, because people would recognize that I was Catholic, and they would come up with their anxieties about religion and their hatred for the church and things like that. And I was supposed to mollify them in some way.
Yeah.
So that's what the cocktails were all about. But I think that fiction doesn't work that way. I think in art, you put it out there and let people perceive what they want to perceive, and somehow you hope that you'll change them in some way.
Yeah. Well, I want to think about that too, beyond just writers of faith, but sort of the importance of literature,
Right.
more broadly today, and what importance you think the literary imagination has for us today, and what does literature do that seems so urgent? As we're thinking about our worlds and the anxiety of our life, not that it ever was different, but it seems to be peculiarly so these days. Why is fiction important?
The New Yorker did a survey, or at least they printed a survey, and pointed out that people who read literature regularly have greater empathy than other people. And I think they're probably more ethically conscious than other people, just because they understand that we're all one kind of human being. We all have one goal, one major goal, and then the subsidiary goals of pleasure and family and things like that. And once you recognize that in almost anybody you encounter, then you have more sympathy for what they're going through, or more understanding.
Yeah, you said that at one point we look to fiction for self-understanding, for analogies of encounter, discovery and decision that will help us contemplate and change our lives.
I totally agree with myself.
I wasn't asking if you agree. I mean, as you imagine the effects of your work, or as you hear from your readers, is this something that they tell you? Wow, Ron, you really, you affected my perspective. It must be gratifying when you hear that. But can you think
a woman, her husband has dementia, and she goes to visit him every day, and he doesn't respond to anything. But she said she's been reading her fiction when she sits by him, my fiction when she sits by him, and somehow it makes it okay. And I guess she perceives her husband as another character in somebody else's novel, and so she can walk with him.
Oh yeah, that's really it. So it just helps her to be in that space with him in his condition. Yeah, interesting. I wanted to ask you about your favorite writers, and Flannery O'Connor you talk about frequently, and Hopkins obviously you admire. You've said that you are a voracious reader, and I'm just curious, who are especially contemporary authors that you find particularly compelling?
I like Ann Tyler, my friend Tobias Wolff, my friend Jim Shepard. Boy, it's so hard to name them.
Yeah.
I think a lot of like Sylvia Plath's poetry. Mary Oliver is one of my favorites. There's just so many. It's really hard to be screwed down like that.
Yeah.
I feel guilty about the people I haven't mentioned.
I don't think anybody's keeping
Right.
score on that. But so when you you as a voracious reader, you probably just pick up and read anything. But what is a hook for you that says this is something I really want to live with a little bit or invest in?
I think it's always on the level of language. That there's an image or just a way of putting a sentence together that grabs me and say, wow, how'd they do that? How'd they think of that?
Yeah. That's my reaction to Cormac McCarthy.
Right.
Just remarkable. Yeah.
You know, I played golf with Cormac McCarthy once, and we played 18 holes with his brother, and then I hadn't had enough, so I decided to go play another 18 with him. And finally, at the 34th hole, I said, Cormac, would you ever consent to coming to Santa Clara and give a reading? He says, Ron, I'm as likely to do that as dance in the ballet. And since then, I thought about it. Whenever I reject or want to turn something down, I would think, what would Cormac McCarthy do?
That's funny. Did he happen to tell you the secret to the ending of The Road? We're reading that for a class next week. No. We're stuck figuring him out.
I asked him about all the pretty horses that was being made at the time, and he hadn't even read the script. So he just doesn't want to talk about those things.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. Yeah. Oh, well. At the end of Mariette in Ecstasy, and we'll finish here and then open it up for questions. Mariette, this is 30 years after she has left the convent. I won't tell you. You really need to get this book. There's a plug for that again. But she's writing a letter to one of the sisters that she had known when she was a postulant. And at the end of the letter, she says this, if you don't mind me reading it. She's writing, children stare in the grocery as if they know ghostly stories about me, and I hear the hushed talk when I hobble by or lose the hold in my hands. But Christ reminds me, as he did in my greatest distress, that he loves me more now that I am despised than when I was so richly admired in the past. And Christ still sends me roses. We try to be formed and held and kept by him, but instead he offers us freedom. And now when I try to know his will, his kindness floods me, his great love overwhelms me, and I hear him whisper, surprise me. And I just was bowled over by that. that would be the words of Christ to us. And I'm curious, is that angle of vision on spirituality, on a relationship with God for you, but also for you as a writer? You know, are those words of encouragement to you?
Totally. And I don't know if we can change God, but we have to believe we can change God. That all our actions here somehow matter. And this actually, that phrase came from a Jesuit priest who was counseling a woman, and she was trying to decide whether she was going to enter the convent or get married. And she had prayed about it for 3 or 4 months and had come up with a solution. And the Jesuit said, well, maybe God is saying, surprise me. And as soon as he said that, I knew that was the end of my novel. And so I wrote it that way. But one of the other things that you read there was that God offers us freedom. And that's what surprised me is all about, too. That sometimes we want strictures in our lives, but God kind of resists that. Once I was going through the same kind of dilemma, choosing what to do, and I didn't have a direct answer. And my spiritual director said, well, God doesn't make you decide. God will make you decide between good and bad, but two good things He lets it up to you to decide. And so that was the
That would be helpful as a writer too, when you're trying to select what is it that you should include or how you should say something. Yeah.
In trying to select what I'm going to write about, I just some subject just gnaws at me, and I have to get rid of it by writing about it.
Yeah.
And there's no way of anticipating what's going to claw on.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to seeing the next.
Thank you.
The next of your hot pursuits as you're working on them.
Well, what I'm thinking about, or what I've started writing, is about Mariette at 85. Because I thought we need something about dying and approaching death.
Yeah. You have to let us know.
Okay.
When it's coming out.
I hope the world knows.
Well, thanks for this conversation. Ron, I want to open it up for questions from you all. You can just jump right in. Yeah.
I have a question. A lot of, I think, novelists are spiritual or religious in the sense that they believe in some muse, and that a lot of their ideas are outside themselves. And you mentioned ideas that, like, how did I come up with that?
Right.
You're writing. Is that for you the same as God, or is that a different entity, or where do those thoughts come from?
Yeah, it is definitely a different entity, although some my friends think it's all from God, and I just don't believe that. I don't want to put that on God. But there is it's a midway point. I would be more comfortable saying it comes from my angel than it comes from God. But there is something otherworldly that's going on sometimes, very rarely. But I remember once I was running and I came across what I thought was the perfect sentence. And I went home and wrote it down. And later on, a woman saw me at a reading and she said, "Would you read this paragraph?" And she says, "I love that sentence." I said, "That was the perfect sentence," I thought. I don't remember what it was now. I should try and repeat it. But that's what happens sometimes. You can't lay claim to it. It's not your doing.
Interesting.
But I think that happens with all the arts. You know. Michelangelo certainly got lucky with the Pietà.
Yeah. It was commissioned work, but it was
right.
His genius. Someone else have a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
I recently read the book of Marjorie Kemp, the mystic with her holy tears kept being kicked out of everywhere for crying so loudly. And I think about that and Mariette and ecstasy and so much, so much scholarship that goes on, like, Teresa of Avila was having epilepsy, or like
Right.
trying to like diagnose the mystics, and when really it's just probably better to leave it alone. And so I'm just curious, with writing Mariette and ecstasy, were you thinking about any of those kinds of questions of, should we try to investigate this scientifically, or should we just let it be and allow it to be mysterious, or something in between?
Yeah, I read a lot about stigmatics when I was writing, of course, and my conclusion was that there's a questionableness that is intended by God, that we don't know if some people had no religious background whatsoever and actually were kind of living evil lives, and they got the stigmata. And some really holy people got the stigmata. It's hard to figure out why or when or what. But I think they're there to give us significant signs, let's say, of other things going on in the world. That the transcendent really is possible. And that's what I was trying to get across. And I didn't want to be apodictic about it and stamp my feet. This is what you must believe. I just wanted to present it.
And one of the things that gives it real substance is you do a great job giving us the side of those who think it was all fraud.
Right.
I mean, it really leaves us open
Yeah,
to have to decide at the end, which some of my students loved and others hated.
right.
But yeah. Someone else? Just have time for a couple more. Yes, there, and then Carla after that.
Hi.
Thanks for your conversation and speech. Just going off of Cecily's question, I was wondering if you're actually inspired by some of these female mystics and their works like Julian of Norwich, Marjorie Kemp, and whether there were particular challenges in kind of feeling like you were presenting the perspective of a female nun with integrity and truth, drawing on some of those materials.
Right. I try to give hints that this could be fraudulent activity. Like when she first enters, she sees all these medicines on the wall, and you know that her father was a doctor, so she could have concocted something to fake it if she wanted to. And there are actually a lot of things that go on here actually happened to a real woman who's now a saint, Saint Gemma Galgani. And she was from Italy, and she had the stigmata all her life, but she kept trying to enter convents and kept getting kicked out, probably because she was neurotic. But she was quite beautiful, and sometimes in books of saints, she's on the cover. Little known saint, and basically only a saint because she had the stigmata, and some people prayed to her. But there's a lot of the people who've had the stigmata who've been studied have a lot of creepy things going on in their lives, some neurotic backgrounds.
Did you find those that you admired?
I liked Padre Pio quite a bit. And my brother saw a documentary that was kind of poo-pooing him, but that's going to be the case with almost everybody who has extraordinary things.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a real fan of near-death experiences and reading about them. And it's so crazy to hear how scientists try to explain how this is some biological thing that goes on in a person's mind. I mean, you think, how could you have all these chemical reactions that are identical from one person to the next? So I think that is going on all the time, and we just don't notice it.
Yeah, so there's another contact with reality.
Right.
In there. All right. It's great. Last question, Carla.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. Really thought-provoking. I was interested in the aspect of research and accessing archives, like you mentioned, the Kansas City Star, and it seems like also a lot of your books are interested in a historical period or looking to the past. So I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to that sense of history and maybe some of your research practice.
When you're dealing with history, you have a better perspective on what the actions actually meant, because you see what the conclusion was and then the residue that follows. And a lot of the people I admire most, William Shakespeare never wrote about anybody within 100 years of his life. And Isaac Dinesen, the same thing. She always put things in the past. And it's because you can see things more clearly in looking through the rearview mirror. You're in a welter of activity right now, and I don't know what the consequence is going to be. I don't know what to make of it. So it's much more comfortable. And I think there are just great stories back there in the past that nobody knows about because people don't know history anymore.
Ron, thank you for making the trip out here and being with us tonight. We really appreciate it. Great. Let's give Ron a hand.
Thank you very much.
So, again, there are books for sale, unless you brought your own, out here in the lobby, and Ron would be happy to sign them for you as well. So feel free to stick around. Have a good night.